Hey, what's up everyone, Ragey Golden Eagle here, having way too much fun as always. And today we're going to be looking at what happened to video games in order to try to predict what will happen to any other hobby that breaks into the mainstream. And once again, like with all other videos of this nature, this is mostly my own observations living through this transition, so feel free to add your own theories in the comment section below, especially if you disagree with anything I say in particular. I'd love to hear other reasons for the same things I'm about to be talking about. But either way, to get this out of the way right off the bat, I don't hate it when my hobbies go mainstream because I can't be a hipster and say I like underground and non-mainstream shit anymore. I hate it because of the changes that are forced on said hobbies as a result of going mainstream. And this is where it actually gets interesting because, unfortunately for us, in what has to be one of the cruelest unintentional bait and switches ever, those changes are almost always positive at first. The situation always seems to get better before it just completely nosedives. And when it comes to gaming, I would say that the PS1 and N64 era is what really pushed it into the mainstream, especially the PS1. Sony definitely capitalized on Nintendo's then hard-on for keeping their family-friendly image. And as a result of that, they pushed a lot more mature titles onto the PS1, at least when it comes to graphic violence anyway. Here in America, they could handle their blood and gore, but God help you if someone shows a nipple. But either way, Sony definitely seemed to push way harder on this mature image than Sega ever did. Sega's mature response to Super Mario, for instance, was Sonic the Hedgehog. They were pretty much selling Sonic as the edgy teen alternative to the kiddie Mario. But then the PS1 came out and it got stuff like Resident Evil. And the PS1, unsurprisingly, was a huge hit in the mainstream with people who've never really been into gaming much before. And in my opinion anyway, this is where gaming really began to finally take off. And it culminated in what many, myself included, consider to be the golden age of console gaming, the PS2 era. And this was entirely made possible by obviously the PS1, since that is what proved that there is a mainstream market for gaming in the first place, and the investors noticed. These investors smelled the money and started throwing money at game devs, and in this scenario, by the way, I'm considering publishers to be investors, and if you don't think this makes sense for whatever reason, you will later, I assure you. So these investors are throwing money at game devs, and in the end, they reaped the benefits as the combination of growing audience size and growing game quality and quantity resulted in an absolutely explosive positive feedback loop. It was this way at first anyway because it was the same game devs who were there before the boom and who loved the hobby and making the types of games they want to make, just now thanks to the investors, they have a lot more money to do it. And these investors, by the way, they were smart. They wanted to hitch their wagons to the winning horse when it comes to entertainment, and boy did they choose right. While almost all other forms of entertainment were peaking or in decline, video games exploded. And once again, this was due pretty much entirely to the same hobbyists who really loved gaming and making games, and were now able to do this as a full-time job thanks to the massive amounts of new money rolling in from not just the investors, but from the expanding audience. But things didn't stay that way. Because what do you know, as what usually happens, the money they're given doesn't come with no strings attached. You would hope that a lot of these developers would want to maintain their creative freedom and would basically tell potential investors that, hey, if you invest your money with me, it's because you trust my judgment and believe in what I'm doing and just want a cut of my profits. But reality unfortunately doesn't work this way. Even if these game devs may have originally had that attitude, after their teams grew and they had their own giant companies, and they were dependent on this investor money to maintain themselves in between game releases, the money they were being given stopped coming alone and started coming with some demands. Oh sure, I'll keep investing in your company, I'll keep throwing millions of dollars your way, but in return you will need to do X, Y, and Z to keep me appeased and keep the money flowing. I used to work for a private company that relied on investment capital, and yeah, as you could imagine, we were basically the investor's bitch and had to give in to all sorts of counterproductive demands to keep their money coming in, even if those demands resulted in us losing money long term, which ended up annoying the investor even more, which caused us to have to go buy some more of these bullshit demands, which caused more losses, and yeah, you can imagine how that ended up. But as bad as that is, it actually can get even worse for the companies that went public. At least the ones where the owner wasn't smart enough to always hold over 50% of the shares. You guys gotta understand, the second you take your company public and you own less than 50% of the shares in it, you are effectively no longer in charge. You are now at the mercy of the board, which gets elected by the shareholders. Now, while technically that's still true when you're a majority shareholder, if anyone on the board does something you don't like, you can vote them off yourself, since your vote counts for over 50% on its own. And then you get to choose who to replace him with. You're always going to be in complete control of your own company. Well, outside of having to follow all sorts of new laws and regulations you otherwise wouldn't have to, but that's a different topic better suited to someone who actually knows a lot more about this crap than me. So back to the topic at hand, if you have less than 50% of the shares of your own company, you can even be kicked out from your own company that you started. And it's happened before, like most recently it happened to Papa John. So anyway, at this point in time, now that the money is coming with strings attached, we've hit a point where the people who actually care about gaming are no longer in charge. They are now at the mercy of the investors and shareholders who only care about milking the company they founded for every bit of profit they can. And this is where the flip happens. This is where the downhill slide begins after the massive boost in quality that came before. Instead of gamers making games for gamers, you now have investors and the MBAs they hired to run things making games for the lowest common denominator designed by focus groups. And to make matters worse, with the decision makers knowing absolutely nothing about gaming, the community, anything really, they are completely vulnerable to infiltration and subversion by a certain political ideology that seems to want to destroy anything enjoyable in life. But I'm sure you've heard enough about that if you've watched my videos for more than a week. No need to kind of beat on that dead horse here. But now that the most competent people are no longer in charge, that is where the dumbing down begins. And at the same time, coincidentally, in come the predatory business practices. At this stage, yeah, sure. These companies may spend an absolute fortune to make their game look pretty. Maybe they'll even shell out some big bucks to get a celebrity to do a voiceover so they can use this celeb's name to sell more copies. But that's about it. That's all they put any real effort into. Oh, that and marketing. Other much more important aspects of video games, like gameplay for example, are just constantly being dumbed down bit by bit. And we haven't even hit the bottom yet, because to further the now very much negative feedback loop that's going on, if you are an aspiring game developer and you want your best shot at competing with AAA visuals in a much more crowded field, you pretty much need to get a publisher. Again, publishers are basically investors now. Aspiring developers who don't want to be indies pretty much visit publishers and beg for money. And for a case study in how this can work out, look at the saga of Cliffy B's failed studio Boss Key Productions. When they went out of business, they released all sorts of info that was kept secret before, the most important of which for us here being info regarding 3 other proposed projects that they pitched but got rejected by publishers. Every one of them actually sounded, on paper at least, to us gamers, more interesting than what they ultimately end up going with, that being Lawbreakers. But the publishers didn't see it that way. The publishers weren't willing to take any quote-unquote risks. Yet at the same time, they were more than willing to risk shitting out another clone in order to jump on the bandwagon of what's popular at the time. And no matter how well made it may have been, it was still yet another stone on a huge pile of rocks that already had pretty much the entire market picking their favorite rock that they wanted to play with, and they had no reason to play with any other ones. But again, I've ranted about this plenty of times before, so no need to drone on about it now. The point I'm getting at here is that even an industry veteran with great skills, experience, and connections, and also in this case being the lead creator of my favorite game of all time, Unreal Tournament 2004, even with all that under his belt, Cliffy B couldn't seem to find a way to make the games he actually wanted to make and self-fund it. So he had to agree to compromise all of his principles to get that sweet, sweet investor/publisher dough in the hopes that one day he'll become successful enough milking these dead cows to have enough money left over to fund a personal project he really wants to work on. And spoiler alert, we all know how that worked out for him. If he ever chooses to come back into game development, hopefully he's learned his lesson and just goes full indie. Though if he wanted to do that, it would also require him not being woke, since you can't exactly get your audience to directly fund your product if you always insult them, but we'll see. Though on the topic of using your audience for direct funding, with all the high-profile crowdfunding failures and scams out there, the best avenue passionate creators had to actually make what they really want without being beholden to some corporate suits is effectively shut down for almost everyone who needs more than a few $1,000s for their project. There's always going to be exceptions, of course, but I doubt we will ever see another Star Citizen scale crowdfunder anytime soon, at least not for video games. Thankfully, though, other industries have not been having the same issues. Look at Comicsgate, for example. The first wave of projects that got funded in the Comicsgate arena are already starting to get into the hands of customers, so that's good for them. But when it comes to gaming, any grand idea that sounds too good to be true most likely is. And it's extremely important to remember the past because we may see all of this again in the near future. For example, watch for the signs in anime, as once again anime seems to be on the verge of almost becoming mainstream. I can only hope it actually falls short like the past few times, but you never know. It might actually happen this time. If we suddenly have another golden age of anime and Crunchyroll and Netflix are rolling in so much money that they're funding even more anime every season, it's only a matter of time until the entire industry grows dependent on them. At first, they're just going to be the angel investors giving big bags of cash to directors and animation studios that have grand original ideas that need funding. They're going to be the heroes to artists everywhere, giving them the money they need to follow their passion and make their dreams a reality. At first. Then after a while, they're going to start coming in and saying, hey, if you want to continue getting our money, you're going to have to make some changes. And what we saw with video games is going to happen to anime. Though I'm not too worried about that, to be honest, because as I said earlier, anime has already failed to go mainstream multiple times in the past already, and hopefully will again this time. Though given the absolute state of the Western entertainment industry, they may actually succeed this time, to be honest. They don't really have any competition anymore. But if the worst case does happen and anime does finally break into the mainstream, we will at least get a new golden age of good stuff out of the deal. And after the decline begins, you just know some other country's entertainment industry will be waiting to lap up all the unserved fans that anime is leaving behind as it gets woke. In much the same way that Japanese devs as a whole are making money hand over fist giving Western audiences what they actually want while the Western industry rots. That's all I gotta say, guys. Thanks for listening.